We are going to talk about some court cases that were very important to the civil rights movement. We will begin by talking about how courts affect laws, and then we're going to discuss two very important cases, Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education, and we will discuss how these court cases affected Americans. We know that we have three branches of government. We have the legislative branch, which makes laws. We have the executive branch, which carries out the laws. And then we have the judicial branch, which judges the laws. We know that this means there are certain courts, the high courts, that can decide whether or not a law follows the Constitution. And if they decide that a law does not follow the Constitution, they can get rid of it. Not every court can do this. But if you have a decision in a court that you don't agree with, you can appeal it. And after you appeal and appeal and appeal, eventually you get to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is the one who really has that power to throw out laws that they don't think are right. So our first court case is called Plessy versus Ferguson. This case goes way back to the 1800s. In 1890, Louisiana was beginning to segregate, and they passed a law mandating making sure that African Americans had to ride in separate railroad cars. Homer Plessy was 1/8 black, so when you looked at him, he looked very white, and he was arrested for sitting in a whites-only car in 1892. He appealed his case, just like we talked about, and eventually in 1896, the case reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that states can regulate the separation of public facilities. And they famously started a term called separate but equal. And by this they meant that just because we said someone had to be separate didn't mean they were unequal. And this is how they got around remember those Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that said that African Americans were citizens. And because of Plessy versus Ferguson, states all over the country began to segregate. If we look at these two pictures on the right, this is a movie theater, and you can see kind of over here it says colored admission 10 cents with the arrow pointing upstairs. Many movie theaters, the African Americans were forced to sit maybe on the balcony or in a separate section. Over here you can see water fountains. This one says colored only, and this one said white only. I think we can probably go out on a limb and assume that the white fountain was probably a little bit nicer than the one for African Americans. If you look at this picture, this map is talking about educational segregation. So we're talking about separate schools. In all of these red states in the South, separate schools were required. Yellow states didn't have any legislation either way. Blue states, it was optional or limited, so school districts could decide whether they wanted to be segregated or not. And then these green states are where segregation was forbidden in schools. Our second court case is Brown versus Board of Education. In 1951, the NAACP encouraged 13 African American parents from Topeka, Kansas, to sue their local Board of Education to allow their students to attend the white schools. A lot of the white schools were nicer, they were even closer to home. The man whose name is in Brown v. Board, his daughter was named Linda Brown, and she had to walk past the white school to get on the bus to the black school that she had to go to for elementary school. And so they sued to try and get their kids to go to the schools that, frankly, were closest to where they lived. The local courts said Plessy versus Ferguson says we can do this, and so these parents had to appeal. By 1953, this case made it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court unanimously, which means all of the judges agreed, that separate but equal is inherently unequal. That just by separating people, you are saying that they are unequal. If you're saying one group goes here and one group goes here, you're saying one group isn't good enough to deal with the other group. This Supreme Court decision forced schools to desegregate all over the South. The schools were not very happy with this. There were 2 counties in in Virginia, Norfolk was one of them, that closed the schools rather than desegregate. So Norfolk students were out of school for a year because they didn't want to have the black kids going to school with the white kids. So remember these 2 court cases and make sure you complete your activity.